The armistice in November of 1918 was a surprise to nearly everyone and headed off a massive spring offensive planned by the Entente, one that would have included a secret US wonder weapon. Hi, I'm Othais, and this is not a repeat episode. This is the US rifle caliber 30 model of 1903 Mark I. There's a little hole right here, and we'll get into the rest. Now, this in and of itself isn't all that different from our last rifle that we covered, unless you combine it with an entirely different device, the US automatic pistol caliber 30 model of 1918. And I know this seems like an odd handgun. That's because it was a super secret. So, while we take a look at the light box, I'm going to stick one of these into the other one. The handling isn't far off from the 1903, weighing 10 pounds flat, but now shooting semi-automatically. 40 rounds in the magazine, that is 30 Pedersen, a pistol-style cartridge. Hey! And then, I take this doohickey and I just sort of, we're rocking and rolling now. But, unfortunately, we are not yet ready to talk about this gun as it stands because, as usual in this show, we need a little background history. And for that, I have to recommend that you do not go another second further unless you've watched our 1903 episode. It covers all the work up to this rifle, which is integral to understanding what it is that we're building around to get this new Pedersen device. So go check it out. Just in case you're super lazy, this was a 5-shot 30-06 Mauser-derived bolt-action rifle adopted by the US in 1903 and improved through the year of 1906. Trusting that you have watched the required material, we can move on. And this is going to be a unique case because unlike so many other weapons that we've seen in this series, everything about this Pedersen device starts after war were declared. That's right, folks. Everything about this little doohickey came about in response to trench warfare. This was an attempt to get ahead of the trend that was going on in the battlefields. Now, in order to talk about it properly, I'm going to have to walk you through some very basic trench concepts, and I am not anything other than a small arms historian. So this is going to be very brief, very simple, and I know it's going to generate a lot of comments, and I invite them and you can discuss whatever you like. This is like the widest possible lens so you understand what they were going for when they did this. So let's review. You see, we have this trench and those guys over there have one too. We use them to keep low, avoiding gunfire and hopefully the worst of artillery and mortars. The land in between, that's no man's land for a good reason. Every time we try to advance across, the enemy machine guns and riflemen get to work. Generally, this is a complete bloodbath and a stalemate. But if you get really good at coordination, you can break up the defenses. We'll open up with artillery just ahead of our own dudes. We'll then keep up machine gun fire, used like light artillery to saturate the area and suppress, and as they advance, we'll send up light machine guns to further suppress any more determined defenders. That last role was perfect for guns like the Shosha and BAR, and we've also seen that you could, in a stretch, use the Lewis gun. Knowledgeable viewers are going to know that we are pushing up against the concept of walking fire, which is very closely related to what we're dealing with today. In that doctrine, the idea is that you have at least a certain number of men with automatic or semi-automatic weapons with a reasonably high rate of fire, with a reasonably large magazine, and by the way, large by comparison to what was then standard, which was a bolt-action rifle with something between 5 and, if you're French and you really want the old Lebel, 8 shots. That's not going to do a lot at close range unless you multiply it by a lot of dudes, but your enemy also has a lot of dudes. So concept-wise, you want overwhelming suppressive fire. You want to throw a large volume of rounds. You're not really worried about direct hits, but what you want to do is just keep everybody still long enough for you to get into that trench line and do some more damage. Now, that concept was being pushed by the US before their involvement in the war itself. They were wondering if there's anything they could do to gear up for this eventuality. And so, we turn to John Moses Browning. Surprise! He had been developing an idea for a fully automatic 18-inch barreled carbine using souped-up 32 ACP ammo in 100 or 200 round magazines. I'm sorry, I don't have a picture of this thing, nor do I know any drawings of it. He showed the plans for the design to the Ordnance Department in January of 1917, where one official described a device that would shoot bullets like a stream from a water hose. The one thing you learn in life is that you cannot change the past, which is unfortunate because we were apparently somewhere in one alternate timeline going to get a submachine gun with 32 ACP plus B plus and minimum 100 round mags designed by John Browning. And then we didn't. I'm very sorry. I understand that this would have been the C&Rsenal fan favorite of all time, but it did not come about. So instead, we are going to turn to our other favorite designer, one that we talked about in previous episodes, John Douglas Pedersen. If you've been paying attention to the show, you've seen this guy in our Model 10 shotgun episode, and I've taken to calling him the MC Escher of guns. You know you're doing something right when you are John Browning's favorite designer. Now, Pedersen had been running his designs through Remington, and during the war, he saw an opportunity to increase U.S. firepower without adding a whole other firearm to the mix. He would just create an insert to convert the full-powered bolt-action 1903 into a pistol cartridge repeater with a massive magazine capacity. Because of the secrecy around the project, I do not have an actual date for when this was conceived. As a matter of fact, the patent got pushed back, as we'll see. So I'm going to have to tell you that sometime in 1916, before the U.S.'s active involvement, this was the idea that Pedersen had. And he kept it very close to the chest, as did the Remington brass. As a matter of fact, it was pretty much Pedersen, a handful of high officials at Remington, and then Oliver H. Loomis, who was very helpful for refining Pedersen designs into actually fitting in three-dimensional space. These guys were the core of it until they cooked up a cartridge that they could use, at which point they had to involve the ammunition production side of the company and swear them to secrecy. That puts us into a very cool little 30 caliber pistol cartridge, 30 Pedersen. This would later be adopted as caliber 30 auto pistol ball cartridge model of 1918. It was an 80 grain semi-pointed bullet being thrown 1,300 feet per second. It was expected to be lethal out to 500 yards. This proved, however, to be a bit enthusiastic. The cartridge would be produced by the Remington UMC Bridgeport factory, and the earliest head stamps were 9mm BS. While this was explained as Browning short, we're betting it was an inside joke, as the whole project was still a secret at this point. Alright, we've got the gun. We've got the ammo and magazine system. It's all sorted out. It's ready to rock and roll and win a war. But we need to tell the government about it, and we need to tell them quietly so that the Germans don't know. That means they send two representatives essentially down to D.C., probably Pedersen and Loomis themselves, and they knock on the door of the chief of the Small Arms Division sometime in spring of 1917. There, they arrange to have a little demonstration with as few officials as possible. And let me just go ahead and foreshadow something. It always goes well in ordnance circles when almost nobody knows what's happening and we do not properly trial a weapon. Okay, just fair warning. Now, take a moment and pretend you're one of those officials. Okay, guys, I can't just leave that thing sticking out. All right, so you're one of those officials. You're told, hey, you're going to a secret showing. Please don't tell anybody that you're going to this thing. Definitely don't mention Wonder Weapon, yada yada Remington, right? So you're probably a little excited. I mean, this is going to be like super secret war stuff that's going to win everything. And then some dude walks out, and he's got a belt on with all these pouches, and he's got one of these babies, at least to your eye, a Springfield 1903 bolt-action rifle. And he starts whipping out 30-06 cartridges and fires 5 downrange lickety-split. You've seen this, though. I mean, it's nothing that any rifleman can't do in your current army. I mean, this is the point at which you're thinking, big friggin' whoop. As a matter of fact, let me set this up for you. So you have just watched someone fire off 5 rounds of 30-06. Boom, boom, boom. Bolt open, right? Big whoop is what you're thinking in your mind, and then all of a sudden something funky happens. He whips the bolt right out of the action and throws it in his pocket. Now, I'm going to put it on the desk. And then from his other pocket, he pulls out I don't even know what they thought this was going to be, probably a medical instrument. And then he shoves it straight into the back of the action, throws down the lever. From another pocket, he pulls out this magazine, shoves it in the gun. You have no idea what's going on. Remember, you have no concept of what's going on. And then he racks that back, sets it on his shoulder, and proceeds to, as fast as he can and highly accurately, with no recoil and almost no noise, put out 40 rounds of some light cartridge. Just boom, 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 boom. I mean, boom, 40 rounds, right? And then, before you can say anything, he whips the mag out, tosses it aside, and grabs another one, throws it in, racks it, and does it again. 40 rounds. You've just seen 80 rounds go down range out of a standard U.S. rifle in seconds. That, to the few people who were gathered, was absolutely astounding. It looked like Pedersen had turned the average infantryman into a lone machine gunner. There were, however, concerns about performance. This was, after all, a simple pistol cartridge. Remember, 30-06 was a long-range heavy hitter, and its design included the ability to penetrate light cover, steel armor, things like that. To that effect, it could pierce 60 inches of wood within 200 yards. 30 Pedersen can only penetrate 8 inches at the same distance. But here's the thing, people are a little softer than wood, and 8 inches of penetration is still pretty good at short range. It's not going to be a big problem. And not only that, but this thing has almost no recoil, and you get 40 rounds. You have a lot of chances to ventilate some poor sucker. If they don't go all the way through, that's his problem, not yours. You see, the expectation was that you could use your regular bolt to snipe away at long range. Then, for attack, swap in your Pedersen device and load your 40-round mag. This was expected to be good up to 500 yards, so rush and clear the enemy line with rapid fire. Then swap back to your long range if and when desired. So that means we get to keep our bolt action Betty in 30-06, and we still get this steaming semi-automatic in a 30 pistol cartridge for the cost of not a lot of weight. I mean, you're looking at like 10, 12 pounds of additional gear in order to carry one of these. And check this out. This was the plan. 2 mag pouches, 5 mags per pouch, 40 rounds per mag. That is a ton of ammo to carry with you. And that expectation was that you could then use a lot of it to get to the trench. And then once you were in the trench, you had plenty left over to defend it from the probable immediate counterattack. So don't forget, that's a big concept with the trenches. You got to get there and hold it. Well, we're looking at a Siege of Plevna situation where once you're there, some of your guys will be switched out to their Pedersens, and some of them will be switched out to their 30-06. And that gives you some long-range, hard-hitting fire, and when they close the gap, you can open up with the good old semi-automatic short-range pistol-style cartridge. All right, we're back at that demonstration. We can't go to trials, but we gotta show it to somebody that knows what's up. So they take one Captain Beatty and a young Julianus Hatcher, and they swear them to secrecy and send them off with a few representatives from Remington to France. Now, I believe Pedersen was among them. I saw notes that he was approved to go, but it doesn't mean that he actually went. He was just approved to go. He probably went. Anyway, they put it on display for none other than Pershing himself, along with select officers. And by the way, this is the man who refused the Lewis gun once it was ready and available in theater. All right? So, of course, when he took one look at this thing, he said, I've got to have 1 million of them. They're amazing and I love it. Maybe not quite those words, but he really did enjoy this as the new wonder weapon. And so they would put in an order for 100,000 U.S. automatic pistol caliber 30 model of 1918s. Wait, what? A pistol? Pedersen's device had already been developed in secrecy, so why not keep it that way? There was no need for anyone to know that the U.S. was about to have overwhelming firepower. That's right, this little doohickey buried in this gun is a pistol. At least that's what we're going to call it so that baddies don't find out. All right. Since it's just a rifle, let's set it back to rifle. And I'll tell you that right about now, there was some controversy because as far as people knew, the U.S. had just adopted a new 30 caliber pistol and we're spending a lot of money on it. We already have the 1911. We already have some arrangements with Colt and Smith & Wesson that we'll talk about later. And as far as the U.S. is concerned, we're allergic to anything under 45. And probably for semi-good reasons. Nobody wanted a 30 caliber pistol, and so these guys that were defending the secret actually took a lot of heat and had to quietly be like, no, of course it's a 30 cal. What are you talking about? It's a great idea. They had to actively defend what is probably the worst sounding idea, and the whole time they must have been going red behind the ears, just irritated. I find that part of the story just really kind of funny. Now, we are finally at the adoption of this particular system, so we can finally take a closer look. So I'm going to bring this guy down, and then I'm also going to go ahead and grab my 1903, and I'm going to set him in here just as well. All right, right off the bat, right off the bat, these are nearly identical. You're going to see a blued finish on this one. That's just a slight difference. You know, these could have been blued or parkerized by the end of the war. What we really care about is that there's really no external difference at a glance. So it'd be pretty hard to figure out what was going on with this gun unless you spun it around. So let's work on that. Nothing like a good juggling axe, gentlemen. I am getting very handy at this process. So back into the light. We have the regular 1903 here. No changes up front in the sights, nothing in the stocking, but instead, pay attention here. Pay attention to the back of the cutoff. Those are going to be your two visual clues from Mark I rifle. Dun-dun-dun. We have this cutaway to serve as an ejection port for the Pedersen device. More on that in a moment. And then you can kind of see that there's just a difference in the setup for the cutoff. And if you really look down in there, we're going to have a notch. So, right back in there. And I'm going to have to reach for the good old patented plastic. Right down, way down in there. See that guy? That's important. More on that in a moment. That's it for external features, but there's a couple little internal changes that I want to be able to show you. So I'm going to get this other gun out of the way. Oh, there we go. I'm going to take this bolt out. So flip out and down. Now you're going to have to look carefully, but you're going to see in here a little crab-like pincher as I pull the trigger. That little piece going forward, that is going to be the secondary sear specific to the Pedersen device. So let's get a look at that action. Wonk. And by the way, if you have a Mark I rifle, chances are you have a regular magazine cutoff and a regular sear in there. Go ahead and check just to be sure. So, Pedersen device. That's pretty wild looking. And if you didn't get a good look at it, you might not know what it is. Although a lot of sort of sub-caliber systems today look a lot like this because it's the same concept. You'll notice right off the bat that this section here looks just like a 30-06 cartridge, and it has to because that's how this whole thing aligns in the chamber. Now, given each individual gun, there's going to be a little bit of depth difference in the setup, and so this whole thing has to have adjustable headspace. Not internally, not headspace for the pistol. This whole thing has to act like a giant cartridge with adjustable headspace to fit into the rifle so that we don't end up with a gap where it locks in so that it doesn't hammer itself back out of the action, crack parts, that sort of thing. So that adjustment is done up here. Now I don't have the wrenches with me, but there's a set of wrenches for this where you would hold on to the upper portion. This is a Knox form here, and then you would hold on the lower portion. And what you do is you get this guy loose, you set this to the correct depth, and then you tighten this back down. Now, a little looseness while we're demonstrating the gun, not a big deal, but when we go to fire it, we want to make sure that this is exactly right. There's actually ordnance reports of this part being maladjusted, causing this little guy back here to fail. And that's the next most interesting part of the whole system. That is the only thing holding the action in the gun. That little guy right there. I went over this thing twice because I couldn't really believe it. And yeah, there's some pressure coming from the sear and stuff like that, but reasonably the only locking surface is that, which is hitting that magazine stop. It's a good thing that this is a low recoil system. Okay, so overall this is a semi-automatic, so it's a sliding bolt. I don't want to get it all the way back because we can only return it to the action with it decocked. So I don't want to cock it out of the action. It just doesn't seem necessary. And then when we want to fire it, this right here is what is known as the rocker. That's going to be where our internal sear on the gun catches. You'll see more of this in the animation, but pushing that forward, not in, is what's going to tip the sear back and allow that firing pin forward. Otherwise, pretty straightforward system. Now, I know a lot of you are excited to get into this, so I'm going to take it apart. Let's take a look. All right, so here is our barrel section. And this is a barrel. This is not smooth bore. And there's a deep shank on there. Now, that is rifled. And this is a very easy to fail part if you don't have it set up correctly for the system that you're using it in. Now, the bolt face is also pretty interesting, but it's going to take us a moment to get there. So, there's a plunger here, depress and twist. And let me tell you, working on this thing, I have become an expert at reassembling these. As I take this off, you're going to see that we have a buffer spring. All right. We have a central rod. There's 2 springs on here. This spring and plunger, the outer section, they power the bolt body. They're what's actually throwing the bolt body back forward and back into battery. This inner spring here, that's powering our firing pin. All right. So we will carefully remove the system. I'm going to go ahead and get this plunger out of the way so that it doesn't get lost in spring. And then I'm going to pull back gently on this action. What you're going to see is basically an attempt at a waterfall, or sorry, a water fountain. This guy pops up on his own. And that's because the entire time that this system has been in play, the bolt body is holding this timing lever down. Okay, so the bolt body wants this lever to be downward. This lever wants to come outward. And so that acts as the disconnect, because until we are in battery, this cannot relax enough for this to come out and engage the sear. Again, much more visible in the animation in a moment. I can lift out probably the most complicated part in the whole thing, which is the rocker arm assembly, which has a rocker, an arm, a plunger, and a coil spring all set down in there. Again, Bruno had his hands full with this. Everybody thank Bruno. Now, I'm going to pull out the timing lever, which is basically the disconnect, but we can't call it a disconnect because we don't want to have 2 sears and 2 whatevers for the gun, although disconnect isn't really the biggest thing in a bolt action rifle. It's better just to name everything to this system. It's also really good at obscuring what we're doing in manufacturing. Now, I'm going to pull the bolt body free, and then I can remove this guy who acts as our stop and sort of locking lug, and he just needs a little wiggling. He's free. This is it. This is the locking surface for the entire system. This thing is Ross rifle terrifying to me, but the recoil's so low, I guess it's not a big deal. I'm actually going to go ahead and return that part right back there so I don't set it out of my own sight. All right, so now we have the bolt body, and then this section here is just weight. It's just so that you can get a grip on the action and to add mass to the whole system, just like that forward mass on the Dreyse pistol that we saw in a previous episode. If we flip her over, we're going to get the firing pin out, or technically striker in this case. She's set up nice and simple. Now, at the face, just a regular extractor, we have 2 notches here for the alternating rounds of ammo as they come into the system. And we have 2 gas escapes, both of which vent unusually towards the magazine side. So when you see this fired in a moment, you're going to see some gas escape. That is the fact that we over-lubricated the system to keep it safe, and then we heated up the lubricant. And then it all got pushed out the magazine, which was just probably the most horrifying thing I've ever seen by an intentional design. It still terrifies me, but that's how the gun is set up. All right, that is the entirety of the Pedersen device. Now, a lot of you are thinking this is fairly simple, except for the complex sear shapes. But I'm going to tell you, just from a design standpoint, the fact that everything is set up on this in like 2 sets of balanced springs means that if anything goes wrong with these springs, this system isn't going to run very well, and it's going to be very sensitive to the ammo load. So variances in wartime ammo are going to play merry heck with a gun like this. Now, I've gotten this all apart for you, and I guarantee you what you want to see is it in the action in a little bit more detail about the magazine. So I'm going to reassemble it, which I never do in this series, but this has to go back together in a pretty specific order. And just in case anybody ever happens to find one of these again, I don't want them to make a mistake with it. So you get to enjoy me doing something in reverse. So we've got our body. Oh, and while we're here, actually, I should say, headspace is set by the fact that this is very deeply nested, and literally the headspace is just that contact. So there's no adjustment, there's no walking it back. If these parts start to wear, you're going to have to replace them, because that is it. Because the whole thing has to be able to move back and forth to headspace into the rifle itself. There's no adjustment here. All right, so let me get this back together for you guys. Firing pin can go ahead and go straight into that bolt body, drop her all the way down, and then we can go ahead and insert this into the action. When we do, there's a cut on the underside of the bolt body. You want to make sure you align that at the front so that you can get the rocker in. Now, the rocker has a notch, well, actually it has more of a half circle cut and then a notch. Half circle cut goes to the front pin, rock it back, press it in. Now, you should have clearance at the back, if you rock it back just a little bit, to get the timing lever in and then hooked back up. So it goes in deep, and then you pull it back towards you and forward, and now the timing lever is there. Hold it with your thumb or it'll go flying, and then when you push the bolt into battery, now the timing lever is held by the bolt body, and then the rocker is held by the timing lever. So none of this will go flying as long as you don't let it pull too far back out the action from here. That part alone is like a Chinese finger trap. You just have to know which to do in what order and to take advantage of that cut. Otherwise, you're sitting there with these parts in place trying to shove the bolt body back in and it doesn't work. Ask me how I know in a field with a tarp. All right, so we have our plunger that we can go ahead and set back in here so that we don't forget, because I always do. Then we have our buffer spring. We have our spring system, and if you just give it a little wiggle, she'll align herself just fine. Give her a good press in to make sure that she's actually clear, and she is. Then we can go ahead and put our cap on, push our plunger. I'm sorry guys, it's hard to do this on camera, and so I'm holding the plunger down and turning this. I'm sorry, my big hand's in the way. Let me give you a little bit of a view. I'm mostly just trying to keep anything from flying. So we're in, and then all it is a matter of screwing our barrel back and adjusting it for headspace. I can eyeball basically where it needs to be. Again, we'll get a nice fine adjustment on this before we hit the range. That is our system. Now, at this point, I'm going to tell you I've made one critical mistake, which is that, oh no, wait, I have my firing pin in first. I'm sorry. The critical mistake would be adding the firing pin later, because then you have it in the cock position. You'll have to manually decock it before you can put it in the action. All right, so I can finally return this to the proper gun. So let's take this in, get her back. All right, this is the magic moment. Take this guy, lower him in there, flip my lever that's going to engage that little lock with that notch, the most terrifyingly small surface you could imagine, and we're set. We just need to insert our magazine. And speaking of which, this is it right here. Now, these guys are, let me give them a little space, 40 rounds with 5-round increment windows. They have this beautiful embossing so that you have a good texture for holding on to them, and it adds some strength to the body. In addition, this ridge right here exists only on the back side. It's flat on the front so that you can grab it, get a thumb on there, and even in low light know which side to point back at yourself. I find that it is easiest to load these, upside down hand, in, back, forward, rattle. Now I'm going to show you that again in close up. So let's get her down. And we'll take this out and back. So that was the reverse. What we're looking to do is there's 2 fingers here. See them moving a bit? These guys flip over this Y shape here. And then there's another Y shape at the front that engages on those 2 claws. So to insert, I'm sorry, I'm trying to get you just the right angle and still see what I'm doing. We gotta aim here, and believe me, there's no macro motion to this. This is a fine adjustment, not gross adjustment maneuver. It's a little unfortunate because it just takes a little bit more fiddling than you would hope. So we gotta get her sort of lined up on there. When there's ammo, I will tell you it's a little bit worse because you have to push down against the ammo. So line her up, push her back, so they came back, push her in at the front, let her forward while holding her against the bolt, and that's it. She's in. And that, with extra ammo in it, seems so like not the strongest locking mechanism. But it does work. All right, so there's our magazine. We feed down and into the chamber, and then we eject over on the other side. And I will say, from a mud perspective, this is pretty closed up. There's not a lot of openings to really get at the semi-automatic part of this gun. I mean, if we take the mag out, we can see the bolt coming back and forth, but otherwise, not so much. And speaking of that, I want to show you our ejector is the firing pin. So as we come back, that internal rod will press the firing pin forward. And of course, it's forward already right now. Let me get this to full cock. So now she's cocked. So as we come back, eventually we'll have our firing pin peek out, and that acts as our ejector. So just boop, right there, eject. I'm going to tell you, ejection on this gun is not super reliable because it really doesn't get directed as well as you'd hope. It's more of a central poke, and it could go either way, and it relies on the fact that there's a cartridge in this magazine. So we found that when this thing was empty, it would often jam up on the last round because it was random whether it got out of the gun or not. Okay, we now have had a very good look at the system. I think there's more data on it out there now than there ever was before. And a lot of this, I want to say a special thanks to Bruce Canfield. He wrote the book on U.S. Ordnance so far. Not just the book, but the books. And so if you see a Bruce Canfield book, please pick it up. He has absolutely been an inspiration to this show. And he was kind enough to lend us a Pedersen device. So that is a man who's not only dedicated to preserving history himself, but allowing others to preserve it as well. Beautiful, beautiful man. But let's talk about the gun. It's time to turn this over to Bruno and enjoy his hours of frustration as he animates out the Pedersen device. First things first, this is still a 1903, firing 30-06. But if we flip the magazine cutoff just so and release the bolt, we can now insert the Pedersen device. Slap on a magazine, rack that bolt, and we're good to go. This is a blowback semi-automatic action. The requisite mass is gathered on the bolt body itself, to the rear. When we pull the Mark I trigger, it tips a smaller sear forward. This engages the rocker arm. The rocker arm, in turn, acts like another sear, freeing the striker. The timing lever acts as a disconnect, holding the rocker assembly up when the bolt is out of battery. To keep things simple, the striker also serves as the ejector. Alright, otherwise this is pretty straightforward, so let's wrap it up and get it over to Mae.
We come from every quarter, from the north, south, east and west, to clear the way to freedom for the land we love the best. We've left our occupation and home so far and near, but when the going's rather up, we raise this song of cheer. Good morning, Mr. Zip, 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 with your haircut just as short as mine. Good morning, Mr. Zip, 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 you're surely looking fine. Ashes to ashes and dust to dust, if the camels don't get you, the Fatima's must. Good morning, Mr. Zip, 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 with your haircut just as short as, your haircut just as short as, haircut just as short as mine. Good morning, Mr. Zip, 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 with your haircut just as short as mine. Good morning, Mr. Zip, 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 you're surely looking fine. Ashes to ashes and dust to dust, if the camels don't get you, the Fatima's must. Good morning, Mr. Zip, 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 with your haircut just as short as, haircut just as short as, haircut just as short as mine. You see them on the highway, you meet them down the pike. In olive drab and cocky, our soldiers on the hike. And as the column passes, the word goes down the line. Good morning, Mr. Zip, 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 you're surely looking fine. Good morning, Mr. Zip, 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 with your haircut just as short as mine. Good morning, Mr. Mr. Zip, 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 you're surely looking fine. Ashes to ashes and dust, dust. If the camels don't get you, the Fatima's up. Good morning, Mr. Zip, 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 with your haircut just a short ass, haircut just a short ass, haircut just a short ass mine. Good morning, Mr. Zip, 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 with your... Your haircut just a short ass, haircut just a short ass mine.
Pew, pew. And it's not much louder than that. This thing is quiet. We did not adjust the balance between the 30-06 and the 30 Pedersen. We wanted you to have the full effect. Fantastic, isn't it? Now, this particular gun was ordered in March of 1918. That's how long it took for everybody to review. This is enthusiasm from the government. Still takes that long to get the actual order in. 100,000 at first. This was later raised to 133,450. Also, don't forget from our previous episodes, there is a more common U.S. rifle, the model 1917. I'm sorry to say, I do not have an example for what you're expecting next. But yes, they did work up a Pedersen for the 1917. This would be the Mark II rifle and device. Roughly 350,000 would be ordered, but never saw mass production. Ordnance believed that each one of these devices was going to need about 5,000 rounds of ammo, average of 100 a day, and their estimates for fighting, some margin of error, yada yada, plus and minus. This ends up working up to a contract for 8 million rounds. All of them to be supplied by Remington at Bridgeport, along with the device, because realistically, Ilion was full. Like, they were already making a lot of other stuff for the war, like the 1917 we saw. They're at production capacity. It's time to expand the existing ammunition factory. That means that every one of these little guys comes out of Bridgeport. Now, all of the Mark I rifles would be produced at Springfield Armory. And while they were not sequential, we know that the first one was serial number 1,034,503. Now, as we've seen in this show before, tool up and manufacture takes time. So when you say you have to expand an ammunition factory and recruit labor under secrecy to produce a weapon that needs to integrate with another weapon, so it's really fine adjustment, well, that's going to be pretty difficult. And so Remington at Bridgeport went scrambling. The government authorized $500,000 in assistance for getting everything up and running. This had to be radically expanded. It would keep growing until over 6 million, and that's even including Remington making use of manufacturing tools that were abandoned, essentially, when the French and the Russians gave up their contracts on certain rifles that they were producing for them. It was very expensive to expand that facility. And part of that number, if it seems really ludicrous, is because they were also expanding to produce the Browning automatic rifle. So with all the hiccups and things, production really doesn't start rolling until sometime around December of 1918. There's examples available in 1917, a couple dozen maybe, but we're really not honed in on the gun just yet. And to be fair, that's acceptable because the order from the start was we don't want them piecemeal. We need a minimum 50,000 ready to go, or else we're not sending out a single one. Because the idea is that we don't want anybody to know they exist until it's too late, and then we're going to throw them out in a big old wave and surprise the Germans. And as part of that, the US was planning on using this device in the spring of 1919, because every year, as winter fell, the war slowed down, and people stopped pushing around as much. And then when it thawed out and the ground became firm again, it's time to march. And that was going to be the time when they unleashed their combined arms tactics along with these little wonder weapons. And that would have been a beautiful plan if not for the fact that armistice were declared. Without a war to fight, the government didn't really have a lot of interest in secret weapons anymore, especially spending millions of dollars on them. So that 1917 Mark II, that vanished. The order for 130,000 of these guys turned into an order for a little over 65,000. And then the rifle production, this is very curious. The Pedersen devices, the 66,000 from Remington, they were ready by spring of 1919. They were already on the path. Remington wanted them done. The Mark I rifles to be produced by Springfield, I don't know if they would have met their projected date, because when the government slows something down, they slow it down. There is no investment in hurrying anymore. So they would produce their rifles much more slowly, and interestingly, they just kept producing them. They made 150,000 plus Mark I rifles for the Pedersen device. They had 65,000 Mark I Pedersen devices. I'm going to say this seems to be one of those times where there's two sides of what's going on, and they don't know what the other one's doing. A very common government/private contract thing. And we see it time and time again in this episode, because you're going to see the secrecy last longer than the will to actually use this for anything reasonable. Government work, right? Anyway, the whole thing gets mothballed actually around 1920, because Springfield's still producing these rifles until then. So that's when everything sort of goes into storage. More importantly to Remington, they wanted that patent button down. It had been postponed for secrecy, but now that the war was over, they wanted to hit the international market to make up real money. They're not getting it from the US anymore. But the government kept stalling, again, over this secrecy. In the end, they got their patent approved 3 years late, and the government still kind of sat on them and said, come on guys, keep on the down low. We don't want everybody knowing about these things. So they didn't have a lot of chance to market them internationally, because they didn't want to tick off the big old US. That's problematic for Remington. They have investment in this. They have time in this. They'd like to make money on it, and they think it's the next big deal. I mean, it was going to be a super weapon. Now it's nothing? Anyway, they turned back to the US and said, look, you want to buy us out of all future profits on this thing. You want the whole kit and caboodle to keep us shut up and to have the device and all the rights to it, the whole bag. $15 million. And the US's accountants laughed at that one for quite some time and paid like nothing. Still, there was a profit to be made, especially by Pedersen. He was paid $100,000 for his license to Remington, half of which from the company and the other half from the US government directly. He also received a royalty of $1 for each device sold in the US, and would have had $1.50 for any foreign sales, plus a penny for each magazine. Now, the US government had promised Remington a $2 profit on each one of those devices, and 3 cents on the magazine, I believe. Now, that was a profit that was guaranteed, not the entire price, because at that time, they wanted to keep it quiet and getting rolling, so they didn't bother to say how much is it, they just said throw $2 on whatever it takes to make it. The problem is they started arguing about startup costs. Like I said earlier, those rose to Remington's estimations of $6 million. I know I saw memos of the US government trying to pay out $3 million to Remington at some point. Again, this is hairy. I don't know, because everything was so hush-hush. I haven't found a paper trail that says how much the US actually paid to help with the startup. And again, a lot of that is blended into the production of the Browning automatic rifle, which was also important for the war at that time. So, anyway, now the US government has 65,000 Pedersen devices and more than enough, well, not at first more than enough rifles, but they were on the path to more than enough rifles. What the heck are they going to do with them without a ward fight? Well, they were immediately retested in France. Again, select officers and secrecy. One naval representative based in London had great difficulty finding the demonstrations, as they were so well obscured that no one knew what the heck he was talking about when he tried to show up. Also, there was some additional testing by the US cavalry and infantry boards at home. The overall consensus on the device? It was just too much effort and expense in order to get an advantage over a very niche position on a certain type of battlefield. The boards felt that no man's land fighting began at 400 to 600 yards, but the Pedersen was only good up to 350 at a stretch with actual testing. That meant you had to swap the bolt while under fire. Yeah, that pause in fighting without cover in the middle of a battlefield, let me tell you, you're wasting time already fiddling with it under fire. That's going to cut down on the benefit of the rapid fire later. In addition, the number of men who get killed doing that is going to cut down your overall firepower and efficiency and morale for the unit. So, not a good combo. In addition, that extra weight, yeah, sure, it's not even 15 pounds with all the gear, but it's still in addition to everything else, and we already have pretty heavy men. We don't want to have to weigh them down if we don't have to. Stack on to it the fact that the bean counters and tacticians were both worried about the fact that there was going to be a bunch of these laying all over the battlefield as you tried to play hot potato between your two systems. Again, now realizing that you're going to mostly be under fire. The entire thing is geared specifically to trench warfare, by the way. It's not that applicable in any other sort of combat environment, because at that point you could just substitute this out for a submachine gun, which are new but around. And then that trigger is atrocious. You're going across 2 sears essentially with a big transfer bar and springs. It's like 22 pounds and gritty. And so that's no bueno. Now, Springfield would experiment and get it down to like 12.5 after the war, but that's also after this testing, and it still wasn't enough to really improve all the other problems. And then like the last little thing, you're using this at close range, this magazine's wiggling around everywhere, and you're probably going to want to do some bayonet fighting on the side, and that makes it kind of hard to handle the gun and use the bayonet. They noted it. I don't think that one's nearly as big a deal as some of the others. Now, in testing, ammunition for this gun cuts both ways. Light, accurate, easy sustained fire, lots of capacity at low weight. It's good, right? And it's certainly, we already debated whether or not it'll kill a guy. It'll kill a guy. It's fine, right? One problem. This goes kind of the Harley-Davidson theory of warfare, which is that you want them to hear you coming. Walking fire is set up to be suppressive. So you want it to be scary for the enemy. Bang, bang, bang goes the gun, not pew, pew, pew. And then that ammo, it should crack right by your ear, so you don't want to put your head up anymore. And you'd really like to hear it ding off somebody's helmet, or rather through it, right next to somebody, so that they go ahead and get the message and keep their head down. Well, these little cartridges are not intimidating, not at the far end, not at the shooter's end. And so they felt like this would be a terrible walking fire gun. It just wouldn't suppress. And that's not unreasonable. What is unreasonable is that they were very worried about the fact that you were not going to be able to do much damage to an airplane with this gun. I don't know why they thought that they were supposed to be able to do damage to an airplane with the standard bolt-action rifle either, but that was the thought. I mean, I guess at least 30-06 could theoretically get up there, but I wonder how many confirmed kills there are on that. Seems like a little bit of an overreach. All the theoretical concerns aside, I have some practical work with this gun, and the beautiful unicorn in my hands, to my mind, is absolutely terrible. Unfortunately, this just doesn't seem like a powerhouse of a weapon, and reliability to me, especially without trials or anything else, I feel like they might have missed the mark. And that comes off the fact that we've done a lot of work to get this one up and running. And in that regard, I want to say, by the way, thank you, because we had a sample size of more Pedersens than I think anybody has managed, because we were able to get in contact with our friends at Springfield, our friends at the Night Museum, at the NRA Museum. We had more sample data for Pedersens than anybody in a long time. And what we walked in on was the fact that this is such a delicate balance of springs and parts that, yes, it probably ran just fine when correctly assembled right at the beginning. But the idea that this was going to sustain itself in a battlefield environment and not walk out on so many occasions was frankly a little bit insane. And so some of you are going, but I just saw you fire off 40 rounds on range. I'm going to be dead honest with you. The longest streak we had was 12 shots. That was it. The longest we could get this thing to do in a row. And that was a lot of tinkering. That video was done for your pure enjoyment because there were so many jams in between different shots. And so, let's have a little truth in media. Fail. Bad. I'm sorry that we lied just a bit with that presentation, but at least you know the truth now. And again, part of that though was trying to account for the fact that we did have a few replacement parts going in this gun, and we wanted to give it the best chance of displaying how it should have worked. And there's plenty of proof of these things running for hundreds and thousands of rounds in endurance testing. But speaking of that, when these guys came back, because a shipment at least made it to France, right? I'm not sure how many were in it, but I know at least 50 some odd were tested when they came back. Endurance tests through the early 20s showed consistent problems. Number one, when they came back, they were covered in rust. Like, it was just unavoidable rust. The system is not apparently rust-proof in any way. Once they got them cleaned up and started firing them, they had all sorts of broken arms and bent pins and stretching and walking out of headspace and things like that. But a couple other things sort of came in pretty consistently. One, if you do not adjust the headspace of the device to the gun properly, and you can see there's a little play in this one right now. You can hear it wiggling. That's because I just put this back in for the studio. It's not properly adjusted at this moment. There's enough room in there, enough slack, that when the device first fires, it has an air gap so that it can hammer on that locking piece. And that is going to crack. In addition, they had the angle cut wrong on the rocker arms for a while. This one's later production and actually has the solution built in, but the earlier ones, not so much. They had to be adjusted back if they were going to be issued. They could beat themselves to death internally. Again, all the springs are so delicately balanced that any variation in ammo is going to be a big problem. And frankly, the way that the internal springs are set up after my own personal analysis, you have to have a sort of thin, long draw spring. That's the kind of spring that over time is going to be less capable of pushing itself back out. Thicker, shorter coil tends to last a little longer, and it tends to be what we see in firearms. You don't tend to see these sort of long, stretched out springs like you see in cheap Chinese consumer products, right? But that's what's in this thing originally, is a slightly narrower, slightly more. It's not outside the realm of firearms technology. It's just you would prefer it to be the other way, but that would mean adding a little extra length to the system, which would mean getting into the shooter's face, so they couldn't do it. It's the sort of give and take of a system like this, but that ultimately means that it's not super reliable. I have personal problems with the magazine retention. I think it's very weak. I think it's very prone to damage. Overall, I'm going to have to say that the Pedersen was not going to be the wonder weapon that the US hoped for, and might have even been a tactical disaster on the battlefield. Now, an example of something done right is what the Germans came up with. A tube that shoots 9mm at full auto. A very compact, simple submachine gun. Turns out pistol ammo can be a good thing if you do it right. So we take all those woes and we bag them up, and now this dream of a better future turns into a feverish nightmare of what the heck do we do with this thing? And so the government was left sitting on 65,000 of these and trying to decide exactly where to put them. What if we kept them in reserve for riot duty? That seems a bit much. A sample made to Panama in 1920 had the commanding general in favor of them, but we're not sending secret weapons to Panama. Yes, they're still secret. How about just a gallery practice rifle? Nope, they're too different from a regular rifle. It's going to confuse the dum-dums. Okay, fine. Can we at least improve on these things by changing up the ammo? Tests were done in the early 1920s, usually focused on getting up to 1,500 feet per second, but this always meant having to lengthen the case and ditch the current standing production. One version of the original case with a 90-grain bullet would, however, be used in a prototype Remington military rifle, built specifically to act as a high-capacity, compact, lightweight pistol carbine. This was pursued for a few years, but ultimately dropped. However, it's likely this Browning 1830, named probably because of its design in 1918 in caliber 30, kept the 30 Pedersen lineage alive long enough to hand it over to the French, who would adapt and adopt it as ammunition for their next pistol, with minor changes. So they all sat in mothballs where they'd been packed after the endurance testing in 1922. They just sat packed away, a sweet little military secret. Now, there was an inventory from that period, so we basically know what was available. 66,355 devices, 150,927 rifles as of this date, 60,476 scabbards, 1,580,231 magazines, and an imperial butt-ton of ammunition. And so that's where everything sat until March of 1931, when it was finally declassified. It was offered over to the Navy and Marines if they wanted it. They said no, and in April, nearly all of it was destroyed, and I mean almost entirely all of it. A few choice examples were taken to the side, and the rest of it was melted down, destroyed, gone, except for the rifles. The rifles were still valuable. They stayed in storage for a little while, but starting in 1937, they were converted over to the standard 1903 pattern. That means removing the special magazine cutoffs, the special extra sear in there, and being replaced with normal parts. Those guys went back out for regular service. So that makes this setup an extremely rare bird. These are very, very uncommon, and we were very lucky to borrow this one. All right. I've kind of crapped on this a bit, so let's go ahead and see if Mae agrees or disagrees with me on how she felt using the Pedersen. All right, we made room for Mae, who is currently going through second puberty because of...
Oh, come on. It's not that bad.
It's a little bad. I'm afraid she's just recovering from a cold. We have stretched it to the last possible moment so that she could get her throat back, and this is as far as we made it, but this show's got to get done.
We're doing it, guys.
Anyway, we're here to talk about the Pedersen device, and so I'm going to turn this over to you.
Thanks.
And I guess instead of our usual ergonomics, let's first talk about what it's like to swap between the bolt and the device off that belt, because this is the first time we really involved gear, but we kind of had to.
Yeah.
Otherwise, there's no other way to talk about the system, because it's
part of the process for getting the Pedersen together, so it had to be done.
Right. The idea is not to have a Pedersen device instead of another gun. It's 2 guns in one, so we have to do this sort of Takara transformer modification on the fly. So, what was it like getting a 1903 into Pedersen configuration?
It wasn't actually as bad as I thought it was going to be. You have to put the mag cutoff into the middle position in order to pull the bolt out, leave it in that position in order to put the Pedersen device in, and realistically, it's kind of naturally goes in straight. Like I thought maybe it was going to have some snags or maybe I was going to have to wiggle a little bit. No, that was actually a very smooth process popping it in there. And it's a positive fit. You flip the mag cutoff down, and then from there, she's good to go. Like honestly, that wasn't that bad. In the magazine, though, this one was like a little bit difficult. I mean, they were nice enough to put ridges on the sides so I can easily feel it in the dark. There's a nice ridge on the back of the magazine, too, so I can tell which is the front and which is the back. Hint, ridges are always in the back. And then loading it. You know, guys, we actually got to handle this at Springfield. We went up to the Springfield Museum up in Massachusetts. And I was able to practice this, loading it without any rounds in. Honestly, I found it easy. Tried it again when we got to handle it a second time, and honestly still found it easy. Putting rounds in is an entirely different matter. I mean, you can see how simple this is right now. I could do this every day. I might even potentially be able to do it in the dark. But when there's rounds in there, you're having to fight that spring. You essentially have to push down, pull back, scooch it forward, wiggle it to make sure it stays into place. I mean, I'm doing the hokey pokey here with a magazine. It's ridiculous. You have to go through a whole rigmarole process. And I don't remember which way it was, if it was with the round on the left or the right side of the mag, but certainly there was one way, like if it was on, I think it was the left side, I think was when the round was, and you tried to put it in, it was even more difficult. Like you really have to give it a positive push and keep pushing in as you are pushing the mag forward. And you always got to make sure that you wiggle it, that it is in place, because if you don't, like unlike other magazines that we've had before, all I have to do is pop them on the bottom just to double check they're in. With this one, no, you got to give it a positive wiggle and make sure that it is snug in there. Otherwise, you really honestly don't know. And even the best of us, we thought we checked ourselves, and sure enough, the mag wasn't all the way seated, and it's not going to chamber rounds that way. It's just not going to work. But yeah, popping the bolt in, not a big problem. Actually handling the magazine, big problem.
I am going to have to agree. May I borrow that?
Yeah.
So here's what it comes down to. A lot of you guys with more modern rifles understand that gross manipulation, the ability to sort of toss something in, flared mag wells, things like that, and have the gun direct the action for you, that's what you want in a sort of in-combat service weapon. You want gross manipulation of a magazine in order to load. Mm-hmm. The very nature of these 2 fingers means that we have to align the magazine across 2 points as we set it in. And that usually means, I know this is a bit to describe, but it usually means setting the magazine deep at the center, then that aligns it to the 2 sides, pull back, tip in, push forward while still keeping pressure inwards on the gun. That is all while unloaded. With it loaded, we not only have fine manipulation that we have to do, but we have fine manipulation under tension. We have to finely press that in there. It's going to be out of round left or right, depending on which way the stack popped. And then we're going to have to push that until it's even. Now we have a round that's either to the left or to the right. It wants to make this sit off center from the available space against the bolt, except for those little notches that kind of help. Well, that means it wants to roll one way or the other as we press down. We don't want it to roll. We want it to touch down on the metal of the magazine, and it's a feeling that you have to get used to. It's not absolutely intuitive right at the beginning. Mm-hmm. This is not as simple as tossing in like an AR or an AK mag. You have to look almost every time. I don't know that you could do this in the dark with ammo loaded. So you would have to look, position, push back, push in, push forward, then wiggle. You can't tap, you can't slam, there's nothing to sort of quick check it. You have to check it by just sort of wiggling it, and if that's correct, great. If it's not, it pops out, you start the whole thing over again.
Yep.
Whereas with a tap, if it's not all the way in, the tap puts it all the way in. So there's a lot of extra motion that goes into making sure that this magazine is secured.
Which is ridiculous. It takes a lot.
Yeah, it's very interesting. I mean, I'm not saying, like, granted, I'm complaining about a problem that somebody else solved. Maybe there's an easier way to do this. I'm not the engineer in this case. I'm just speaking to the truth of how difficult it is to get the magazine seated in this gun versus the whole action just slides right in. With or without ammo, the whole thing's perfect just to get that actual, like, semi-automatic pistol system into the rifle. Anyway, let me get this back into your hands.
Sure.
And then now that we have it in the gun, does this really change the ergonomics of the 1903 for you?
It's about a pound, maybe a pound and a half heavier than 1903, but the weight is actually not bad. It's still all right here, so the distribution on that's pretty easy to get used to. And interestingly enough, even though the magazine is sticking out this far, the magazine itself, it's about like an extra half a pound of weight there. It's not really dragging me off to the right. I really didn't feel much of a difference even as I was shooting through rounds. I'm sure there was a difference, but it wasn't perceivable enough to me as the shooter to really kind of tell that. And then I will say, the Pedersen device itself kind of made me nervous when firing because it kind of wiggles a little bit. I mean, yes, you can adjust the headspace in there to make it stiffer and not wiggle quite as much, but we found with this one, where we have it now, it functioned its best, and so it does wiggle a little bit, and that just makes me a little bit nervous while shooting. Just putting it in there just kind of made me a little bit nervous that it still wiggled a lot, but I was like, is that going to be safe? But it handled fine on range. And then the sights, that's about the only other different thing really with this guy, because when you're looking down the sights, you're supposed to be looking here at your rear sight and then through to your front sight. But the problem is the Pedersen device, it actually kind of gets in the way. So you're having to look through it to get to your sights. And the problem is with this wiggling, depending on, your shots, it may wiggle left or right. So you're kind of having to like adjust around it. And a part of you wants to add that to the sight picture, which you don't really want to. And then when you're shooting, this also comes back at your face, which is a little bit nerve-wracking too. But as far as ergonomics go, it's really not that much different except for the weight and then the sights. Those are just the two really big ones in my book, but they weren't that weird. They weren't that difficult for me to handle, to get used to, I guess, on range.
Yeah, I'm gonna have to flash you guys a picture of the sight picture. This is idealized, okay, if you take a look at that. And then, here's the thing. It doesn't stay like that. That back mass locking section likes to cant. And the thing is, it can never cant far enough to completely block the sight picture, but that U on there can get just up to your sight line at its full sort of off-centeredness. Mm-hmm. Now, that means that if you are sort of reading quickly on your sights and you go for the first visible U-notch, by the way, much clearer U-notch than the rear sight itself.
Oh yeah, it's massive.
Right. Then that's going to make you want to momentarily align off and then have to bring yourself back on. It's something you get used to in the gun. It's just, again, one of those non-intuitive features of this system. And I get it. They had to mill so that you could see, but to my mind, I don't understand why they couldn't just flat top the whole thing, make it a little bit wider. You have the same amount of mass, and it doesn't interrupt the sight line at all. Again, there's probably a reason for that that's just buried somewhere in notes that we have not seen. Now, with that covered, I guess we're going to talk about actually sort of readying and firing the device. How does she work out for you there?
All right, so I'm going to have to load a round into this gun. In order to do that, I have to be able to rack it. And you're supposed to be grabbing it back here by the striations, pull it back, and let it fly forward. The problem I found on range with that was back here, these lines are actually pretty sharp. So I was finding I was actually catching my hand on it, scraping it up a good bit. Really wasn't all too pleasant, and I also really was finding myself not being able to pull as far back as I wanted to in order to chamber the next round. Even then, I just now caught my thumb. Good job, Mae. So I found it worked better if I grabbed up here on the top of the ridge. Now, there is one of two things that can happen, though, if you're not careful. One was that if you're using too much of the tips of your fingers, you can actually end up bending a fingernail, and two is you got to really make sure you snap your fingers out of the way. Otherwise, you end up riding this slide. And believe me, you ride the slide on this at all, you are not going to chamber the next round. You really have to be careful with it and make sure you use the pads of your fingers, pull it all the way back, and move your hands out of the way as fast as you can. That would have chambered around just fine. But we just found on range, it took a little bit of getting used to that tactic. But once you got it, you definitely do remember it after the first bent nail, trust me. Then actually firing this gun. Now, the trigger on this thing was quite awful for a two-stage. There's like a significant amount of take up and it's very light. And then all of a sudden it gets really, really heavy, like 20 pounds heavy trigger. And then you maybe pull about 2-3 millimeters, if that, and then it breaks. Like, I swear to God, if you know that you're a flincher, you definitely would not enjoy the trigger on this guy in this configuration. It was completely awful in my opinion, but still went bang. And the rounds, thank you, Jay. He slowly walked these rounds in to get them to work just right, as far as like making sure the rim was right, make sure it had a good bevel, and then like doing different powder loads. Like he worked his butt off to get the rounds to work specifically with this gun. Don't know if they were under overpowered for it. Can't say that, but all I know is that they functioned with this one and we got the rounds off we needed for our segment. So awesome job, Jay. Recoil in this guy is practically nothing. I mean, I'm shooting pistol cartridges out of a 1903. I mean, you could see me on range. There was literally no take up with that. Sorry, I know my voice was cracking on that one, but seriously, there's like nothing to that recoil. The only thing was I was flinching so bad, like I said earlier, just because this block is coming back at your face so fast. If you haven't seen the slow motion on it, go back and watch that. It is ridiculous how fast this giant block moves back at your face, and it is right on your eye line too, so it's actually really nerve-wracking. I never flinched as I was pulling the trigger, but I did flinch after the bang went off. I know that, but I just couldn't help myself. But I mean, other than that, it was still a fun shooter. I wish we hadn't had as many problems as we had on range trying to get this guy ready, because when it did shoot, it was a heck of a lot of fun. I mean, I was just plinking out there. It was great. I felt like I barely needed hearing protection because it was so light. And that's me saying that, by the way, and I wear hearing protection when I shoot 22. Like I really emphasize hearing protection, but the rounds on this were so light coming out of it that it was barely nothing. But yeah, honestly, when it performed, it was a fun shooter.
I'm going to agree that this is actually pretty fun to plink around on the range. I don't know where we're going to go for combat, but for plinking on the range, great. I'm going to get rid of this mag for a second so we can handle this a little easier. The one thing that I noticed to be a big problem with this gun is that it didn't have enough room to do all the operations it needed to do. We cut an ejection port in the left side of the receiver so that we could have an ejection port, and then that means that we have to feed a magazine through this sort of right side opening on the receiver. And other than that, there's nothing else. There's not really a way to route gas away from the chamber, and so we talked about how that would blow out the magazine. And the other thing is the rounds in there, because we have to have this variable system for where the bolt connects with the barrel inside of this that then connects into the headspace of the gun, there's just not a lot of room or fiddling available to control the ejection of the rounds. And I really think they might have wanted to put a little extra effort into some sort of pop-up ejector on the right side to positively kick left, because most of the jams in this gun, to my mind, had less to do with the particulars of the springs and setup in this one, and more to do with that central ejection pin that is dependent on bouncing against either side of the inside of this and eventually bouncing out the left side. So they could slap left or right or up or down, and then eventually they'd have to sort of vibrate their way out the left side. There's no positive direction to go specifically out the left except for the hold from the extractor, but at the sort of like speed that this is kicking back, and with all the other cartridges dragging on the inside as they're trying to press forward with the limited space in here, I found that the extractor would often have trouble retaining the cartridge all the way to the rear. And by the way, that's true in a number of different designs. You don't always have an extractor that keeps the cartridge all the way to the rear of the action, but they usually have action openings that are big enough for that thing to go flying out regardless of whether the extractor does its job all the way through or not. There's just no room for error in this system. And so I found that it would jam on any number of different issues, and some of them more to do with this particular model and some to do with the system itself. But with that said, now's the time where we maybe upset some of the fans or make them happy. Would you be all that pleased if you were told to attack a trench with a Pedersen device?
Obviously, not this one. This one gave us problems on range, but let's imagine we're in an ideal situation where it's running perfectly. Yeah, like in an ideal situation, also I'm in close quarters too with this gun, because that's what I would want to use it for. And I've got 40 rounds of basically glorified 32. Yeah, that actually would be dang decent. I feel pretty comfortable and good about that because it's working well and I'm in a trench short close quarters. Yeah, fantastic. However, people are saying this is like something that you would want to use like even 350 yards out. I don't have the confidence with that guy based on the performance on range. I can't see this doing past 150 yards, which means me personally using it, I'd be in very close quarters. So I'd somehow have to do that hot swap between the bolt and the Pedersen device in a short amount of time. And I imagine the adrenaline pumping through the nerves, it wouldn't be something you'd be super comfortable doing. It's just, I don't know. I can't see myself doing that comfortably or confidently and feeling competent with the weapon at that point. So I guess where I'm at right now, I kind of don't really feel super keen on it. At that point, I would just rather have a regular 1903 or just a submachine gun at that point. Just to have one of the two or both if I could. But I don't know. With the Pedersen, I guess I'm just not super keen on the Pedersen itself for using it in combat because it only really works in a specific situation, in my opinion. So I guess it kind of gets a soft no.
I'm going to say that the Pedersen feels like a weird luxury. May I?
Yeah.
This is a 1903 rifle. We can use it as a 1903 rifle. So I guess no matter what, a Pedersen-equipped 1903, not fixed on the gun, but the option in your pocket, you'd have to say that it's superior to the 1903 because it's everything the 1903 has, plus an extra, which is that in very specific circumstances, you have a little pistol carbine.
Yeah, I mean, it's kind of neat.
Yeah, pistol short rifle, whatever. So it's hard to argue that this is worse than the 1903 in an entirety, except for when you add on the weight and you add on the vulnerability of the system. At which point, I start to feel like the changing of hands and acting as an army, there's going to be mistakes made in pretty strong numbers, and the U.S. government was wise to not pursue this program.
And the Pedersen device also has a lot of tiny little parts that I could see easily getting damaged, because, I mean, you're going to have to be careful with them, and I can't see anyone being careful in the middle of a war.
I do not understand how I didn't see more magazine retention system failures in the notes that I saw. I did not. They must have actually been quite strong. Maybe, I don't know what they really hit on them or anything, but I don't trust a lot of little features about this gun. Now, that means that for me as well, I would much rather not have to worry about the system. Yes, me, like as a soldier of one, would I want the option? Sure, I'll take an option.
Yeah.
But am I really...
If I'm given the choice?
Yeah, if I'm banking on it. Like if I'm like, do I want 100 of these, 100,000 of these? It's a hard point to argue. Yes, maybe in a very specific circumstance it would be better. That circumstance is unlikely to arise. And the bigger thing is, for all the milling and metal and attention that this thing takes and then fitting it to this gun and then making the specific type of gun, the number of man hours in this operation versus the number of man hours in a simple submachine gun, a blowback tube submachine gun, you could give everybody, and by the way, for about the same weight expense, you could give everybody a submachine gun on their back in addition to their rifle.
Yeah.
So that might have been the bigger trick. And I think that's what's really hanging me up. Like, if I'd never heard of a submachine gun, I'd be like, oh, this is kind of cool.
Oh, yeah, right?
And by the way, World War I, it's not like they're floating around. But still, it just feels like it misses the mark. And it feels like something that's, you're doing a lot of extra effort to get, some benefit. But it's a benefit that can be gained much, much more simply. So I'm afraid that I'm going to have to agree with May and say that overall, it's a good thing that these things stayed mothballed. I do not believe they should have all been melted down, though. It'd be nice if there were...
God, no.
Yeah, 65,000 of these floating around for people to play with. All right, so I believe that wraps us up for the Pedersen. I'm sorry if some of you are disappointed, but thanks for joining us, and have a good one. Stay after the credits for any announcements.
Later, guys.
Sorry for the low quality update. I have been up for over 24 hours at this point trying to put the last of this episode together because of an animation and compiling error, and it is killing me. But anyway, I hope you guys enjoyed the episode. This is the hour 450-ish for me out of the past 4.5 weeks, so I'm about to hit the wall and just go to sleep for 3 days. Now, hopefully when I wake up, I will see that many of you have remembered that if you're watching this right away, you have 24 hours or less to go grab this year's World War I service poster. This time it's revolvers. It doesn't seem to be as popular as rifles were last year, and we have double the audience, so that's probably my bad. But it'll be followed by pistols next year, so it'll make a nice set. So by all means, grab one if you'd like to support the show. And otherwise, hit us up on Patreon, that sort of thing. It all really helps. And honestly, I'd be more eloquent, but I don't have the brain for it right now. I'll catch you